So good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for being here with us. We're going to have 1 hour conversation, in my view, with one of the most interesting historians today. YURI SLEZKINE, for those who have not been reading him, in my view, has a very particular talent, and of course it's very difficult to praise somebody in his presence without this looking slightly stupid. But he has this combination between being very precise and at the same time being very imaginative. And also his books are very different to each other. Normally people are taking certain area and they go for it and basically continue till all this is over. But I have been reading 3 of his kind of best-known things. First, for anybody who has been studying any courses of Soviet history or the problem of the nationalities politics of the Soviet Union, you should have been taught about his book about the Soviet Union as a communal apartment. And I do believe that probably for many people this is the only thing that they remember out of these courses. But then he came with a book which was very much discussed about the Jewish century, in which was trying to see these relations between Jews and modernity, which on one level was going in an area that had been studied before, but he, in my view, tried to conceptualize this differently and asking a very simple question: how it happened that capitalism was perceived as a Jewish job and the communism was perceived as a Jewish job too? How these 2 very different versions of kind of modernity have been blamed on the Jews, and does it really mean today that to be modern means to be like a Jews? And then comes a book which is a very big book, so reading it is not going to be a one-night adventure, but he wrote a book about Russian Revolution, and it was on the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, which was a very surprising and strange book. I do believe it comes from a novel which we have read in the 1980s, and this is a novel about the house in which the Soviet leaders, after the success of the revolution, basically housed this new Soviet elite. And it was a book about the revolution which was written very much through the personal experiences of the first generation of the Bolsheviks and their families, because one of the radical and interesting claims of these books, and I'm making it much more profane than it is, so you should read the book, was basically is that in order to understand the first generation of Bolshevism, you should understand this very much as a kind of millennial movement. You have a people who wanted to live not in their time, but they wanted to live in the future, and this created a level of intensity and level of ethics of presence which was totally different than what you can do, and this cannot easily coincide with the idea of the family. So one of the major kind of a crisis that you see is that this type of a neo-Bolshevik cannot transform their values and way of life to the next generation. So trying to understand Bolshevism as one level of a very typical, the end of century phenomena, but secondly as a generational experience, I found particularly extremely interesting, and it explains many of the things. And then when we invited Yuri, and we have been trying to invite him for IWM for a while to come, he came with a project which was about the national canons, the crisis of national canons, and the crisis of Western civilization. Most of the other talks that you have here are about the books that are already written. So the moderator has read the book and asked questions. But now we're going to discuss basically a project in progress. And I know about the project as much as you know. So my first question is, why are you interested in this? What is all this about? Because when you're just reading the title, it very much reminds me of famous Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. Why you find interesting?
Because the mind is closing. When I moved from Moscow to Lisbon many years ago in '82, I was struck by how similar the cult of Camões, the Portuguese national poet, was rhetorically, emotionally, institutionally to the Pushkin faith in which I had been raised. And so I became interested in the canonization of national poets, national bards, reading about the rise of Shakespeare, Schiller and Goethe, Petöfi, Botev, Eminescu, Shevchenko, and others. But at the time, I didn't really know that they would play, or they had played, such an important role in the long and apparently never-ending story of the decline of the West, and that they would end up playing such an important role in my own sort of story of dealing with that. In any case, the following year, I arrived in the United States and started graduate school in Austin, Texas. And at the time, the only required course in the history department was the history of Western civilization, known as Western Civ. No one really was trained to teach it, and yet virtually every graduate student had to, because it was the most important course in the history department, and the same was true of most other American universities. And then in my first job in North Carolina, I taught 2 sections of Western Civ every semester to hundreds and hundreds of students. And of course now, all of that is gone. I don't know if the mind is closing, but the course has disappeared. The word has disappeared. You can't really talk about Western civilization with a straight face anymore, either in political rhetoric or in academic discourse, other than disparagingly. And so I became interested, obviously everyone is interested, everyone around me is interested in what happened. And I should say maybe one more thing is that when I started teaching, the most popular, and I think the best, textbook on the history of Western civilization was William McNeill's The Rise of the West, which was meant as a kind of answer to Spengler. The Rise of the West, published in 1963, I think. And McNeill defines civilization as the largest possible community united by a shared literary canon. And so I think what is striking in today's world, whether we agree with Samuel Huntington's thesis on the clash of civilizations, is that at least according to McNeill's definition, the Chinese, Indian, Persian, Islamic civilizations are indeed civilizations. The Latin American and African ones are definitely not civilizations, and in that sense. The Christian Orthodox one is not quite, and the Western one is not anymore. And so what my work is on right now is it's an attempt to trace that development, see how it came about, and how we got to this point, including the role that the rise of Shakespeare's of all kinds plays in that story.
To what extent this is basically the fact that the West defined its civilization as universal, and you have this kind of a confusion between universalism and imperialism, so you don't know how basically to be universalist and anti-imperialist at the same time, so you start to basically question your own kind of a Western canon, because if you go politically why this course has disappeared, I can imagine that this was part of the story.
I think that's true today, because the West, and again, to draw a distinction between the West, a term that is very much in fashion today, the West as the world's largest empire, or if you will, the strongest economic, military, financial, informational alliance. And Western civilization, which is no longer in evidence, at least rhetorically. So I think today there is a tension between, on the one hand, the fact that the West as an alliance represents itself as global, subscribes to a global ideology, advances what most people call globalization, and its apparently desperate need for an opponent, which circumscribes it as an entity, shall we say. But that has not always been the case. If we go back to McNeill, and if civilization indeed is the largest community united by a shared literary canon, then for about 1,000 years, Latin Christendom was such a civilization. Comparable in so many different ways to the Chinese one and the Indian one and the Persian one and so on. But then a number of things happened. I think in quick succession, in the 16th century, the print revolution and the joint combined efforts of humanists and Protestants undermined the position of the Latin Bible. And then French began its, I think, ultimately successful competition with Latin for the status of the lingua of high culture, lingua franca. Or I should say, but the real revolution, I think, in the history of what used to be Western Christendom, or Latin Christianity, was what happened in France's main opponent, which in 1707 became Great Britain. The invention of a Scottish Homer by James Macpherson, and then, of course, the discovery and the celebration of the Icelandic sagas and the Nibelungenlied and so on, the Song of Roland and others. And so you got the ball rolling, and you had a doctor by the name of Lönnrot composing Kalevala in Finland, and a doctor by the name of Kreutzwald composing Kalevipoeg in Estonia, and so on. But the true revolution, I think, happened in England with the canonization of Shakespeare. In other words, what you were proposing is the cult not of a particular text, but of a writer who was at least as great as his works, or perhaps even greater. And so in the early 18th century, the rise of Shakespeare began. In the 1820s, his plays entered the curriculum. In 1741, his bust enters the Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey. And then in 1769, he is finally crowned at a huge jubilee involving festive processions, bell ringing, recitals, speechifying, and so on. And then within 150 years or so, pretty much every European society had acquired a golden age, because this national poet usually centers something that comes to be known as that nation's golden age, and its own bard. And I mentioned some of them, and you can think about others. It was, by the way, my encounter with my first comparison of Pushkin and Camões, then it was only some years later that I found out that they were formally crowned at the exact same time in 1880, when thousands of true believers, so to speak, gathered around the monument of Camões in Lisbon and Pushkin statue in Moscow. And still today, those two statues are the centers of those cities and nations and and so on. And so again, this is kind of a long story, but I'm almost there, in that there was no longer a common set of texts that used to consist of Christian, mostly Jewish, scriptures, and the Greco-Roman curriculum centered on Homer, who of course was then the model for Virgil, who then became the model for Camões, and then everybody else eventually ended up with a Homer of their own. So that curriculum had come to an end, to be replaced by vernacular pantheons, which ended up fragmenting what used to be Western Christendom, but not entirely, because while the new mass education systems were based almost entirely around these newly constructed pantheons, elites or ruling elites in various European states were reading some remnants of the Greco-Roman curriculum, mostly or increasingly in translation, and then each other's bards, just the big ones. Right, it may not be a coincidence that the most popular ones that combined or rather united everyone, were the ones representing the great empires, Shakespeare, Dante, Cervantes, Goethe. So nobody would read, the Slovenian bard Prešeren, but anyway. And so that was the moment of fragmentation, and then of course we get finally to my time, to that period between the time I started teaching Western Civ and now that I'm about to stop teaching altogether. We have no Western civilization left in the education system. Again, I can say something about what I think actually happened, but you may have other questions.
But yes, of course, it's an interesting story, but there was a moment, this is simply the rise of nationalism. And you're trying to get a national identity, and around the national identity very much is the national poets. But what in my view was changing, and this is what I remember also reading in school, is that you're reading your own national literature, but you always have 1 year in which you're reading something which is the Western canon. And as a result of it, there was something that was a common history. For example, during World War I, because there was so much Roman history in gymnasiums, that anybody who wants to make a reference that everybody is going to understand, he can always basically refer to Roman history. In my view, what is happening is something interesting. In a certain way, you cannot make a reference to Roman history anymore because nobody is studying it to the extent that you believe that every other person knows about it. But coming from where I'm coming, you cannot even make a reference to the national Bulgarian canon, because even this type of a canon has been weakened to the extent that if I'm going to decide to make a hidden quote from Botev, I cannot be sure that more than 20% of the population is going to understand it. Mm-hmm. And in my view, this is my question. At least probably there's 3 things that explain it, particularly in this moment. One is the rise of the visual.
The rise of
visual. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, literature is losing part of the power that it had. My colleague Clement Antonova, who is here and who has been working on the iconoclastic movement in early Byzantium studies, listen, the visual is much more universal. People today, they're not so much sharing texts. They're sharing images. And images cannot create this canonical culture. So the text is losing it. Secondly, why the national text was so important? Because all of them tried to behave like the Bible. Simply, this was the national Bibles. And now you're moving in a kind of a much more secular age in which no book is a Bible. The only bestsellers replace the Bibles in a certain way. Yeah, and this is my last point. To what extent what is civilization is not the culture of what you're reading, but very much the culture of rereading. Because
the culture of
rereading. Listen, you're not reading the Bible. You're rereading it all the time. I mean, you're reading over and over again. You're not reading the classics. you're rereading it. It's always, at least the canon is that in moment of crisis, you're always going to go back. Because I remember, and of course we're going to touch Russia at some point of our conversation, but there was this famous BBC program where you're asking people to select the name of the country, basically with whom the country is identified, and people should vote. And it was popular in every single country. And it was Imersi, there was the name of Russia, and I was absolutely sure that Pushkin is going to win. It was early kind of a Putin's period. All political figures have been very much divisive. Pushkin was so much kind of everything for the Russian culture, and at the end of the day, the person who won was Alexander Nevsky, who was basically unknown to a big part of the population, and part of it was the fear, and there was a very active kind of a government-sponsored voting in the last 2 days, the fear that Stalin can end up as #1. And this is, in my view, the classical crisis of the canon. The same happened in Bulgaria. Botev never made it in the first 10. And I'm interested exactly in this, because if you're listening to the latest speech of President Putin, he's talking very much about the West, and he's very much using civilizational discourse, both for Russia and the West. What is now civilization if there are people who are not kind of sharing common texts?
That's a very interesting question. Actually, according to the most recent poll that I just saw the other day, Pushkin is still #1, with Peter the Great following him. But that depends on how you ask a question. When you ask
they should have voted this TV. This was a TV program. You remember?
Whatever,
yeah.
On the question of Roman history and Botev, I think there's a very interesting difference between the way history and literature are taught today. History, as taught in most European schools, as I understand it, consists of either 2 different courses, world history and then national history, or one course that tries to insert some sort of national story within a global narrative. Literature is usually part of a course entitled English or Portuguese, and includes nothing but the national canon, with some exceptions. Like you, sounds like you read some non-Bulgarian literature in your school. I never read.
It's typical for small countries.
And I've heard those in some, like Slovakia, that's part of the curriculum, but certainly in most European countries, history tends to be global, or at least is moving in that direction, and literature is not. But of course, you're right that literature is not as important as it used to be, and Goethe and Shakespeare are not, don't loom as large as they used to. And I absolutely agree that one reason for this is the slow decline of textual culture, text-centered culture, of literature in general, in particular in the West. Because it's not quite the case in Russia, certainly not the case in Iran, China, or in some ways India, depending on how we define things. So that's also important, or I think very interesting, is that the West is confronting entities that think of themselves, and are thought of, Russia is an interesting semi-exception here, as civilizations still bound very strongly, I think, by common literary canons. And the West, as you say, is not really anymore. And that is going on, I think, at least 2 different levels. One, the national level, where I don't know how well Botev is doing, but in Western Europe, again, Shakespeare is not quite where he used to be, or Goethe in Germany, and what used to be the Western canon is falling apart before our varies. And here I would just note one thing that I think is tremendously important, and that is that in the United States, the Greco-Roman / Christian, mostly in elite circles in colleges, Greco-Roman curriculum began to descend, shall we say, at about the same time when it did in Europe. But it was not replaced by a national canon. Longfellow wrote the Song of Hiawatha in the meter of Kalevala, and Mark Twain did his best to become America's bard, but they failed. And what happened at the turn of the 20th century in American colleges, at Columbia first, and then Chicago, and in a lot of them, was the introduction of Western civilization. And those courses were omnipresent, starting again after World War I. And they usually did not include a single American text. So they consisted of some translated text from the Greco-Roman curriculum, selections from the European sort of philosophical tradition, understood in a particular way, and then certain big names from certain big pantheons. So forget about Botev, but you got your sort of usual collection. And I think that's a very important part of this story, is that the US is not a nation state the way Sweden used to be, and its curriculum was always attempting to be bigger than the country in its culture. And here we come to another, just to add one more thing, is that Western civ phase would come to an end, just as during the Cold War, the concept of the West and the concept of the free world began to compete with each other, with the free world winning out in the late 50s. So in other words, the United States was the center, not just of the West, but was the center of the entire non-communist world, defined negatively as pretty much every place except for the slave world represented by the Soviets.
But here's interesting, because in a certain way, on one level, you have the Soviet project, which was based on the idea of internationalism and new civilization, to the extent that in the 1970s, some of the Soviet leaders have been discussing the possibility of Esperanto being introduced as the official language of the Soviet Union, because they didn't want to give a preference to any of the national languages. At the same time, with the passing of time, and particularly after World War II, but it started before it with the Pushkin story, you start to have a Soviet national canon, which very much was the Russian national canon in terms of literature. Pushkin, but Dostoevsky in a certain way. But Pushkin, 1937, it was very important. I mean, not in a nationalistic way, but the idea was that it comes naturally because of the universalism. On the other side, the United States kind of decided not to have a national canon because this allows them to speak on behalf of the Western civilization as a whole.
Or the world.
On behalf of the world. So this creates a kind of a universalist and much more Western-centered curriculum without a major American authors, without American canon. And I find this, because I'm interested, I'm coming not from history, from political science, what are the political implications of all this? Because one of the things that really struck me was the following. I was always trying to understand what is our common history as Europeans. And here is some funny thing that I want to put to you. I was asking my question, to what extent, because there is no Roman history anymore that we know, there is kind of a not national history that can be easily reconciled with each other. What we started to see as a common history was a certain celebrations. For example, in 2014, there was 100th anniversary of the World War I, and there was 1,000 of publications. And this came to me because this coincided basically with the annexation of Crimea, and one of my questions was, okay, To what extent, for example, the fact that the West reacted in the way it reacted was based on the fact that everybody was reading the same books, and this was about the sleepwalking. What was going to happen if the annexation of Crimea was going to be in 2038, where everybody was going to celebrate the 100th anniversaries of Munich? And everybody was going to read books about this. So to what extent this celebration, which we share, started to replace common histories, and very much they're also shaping the opinions, particularly of the politicians who are not kind of also studied in history and educated in history like the previous generations.
Well, you said Europe, you said we as Europeans, and that's different from the West.
Yeah.
Right, because the center of the West is in the United States, at least in so many different ways. Yeah. And so you have to come up with something that would bring all of them together. Yeah. And then there is this, if you will, problem or challenge of including much of the rest of the world somehow, especially in an age where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is perhaps a much more sacred text for this new age than Shakespeare used to be in the previous one. With regard to Pushkin, you're right, of course, that there was a very brief period in Soviet history when the curriculum was going to become Marxist, and Pushkin, as the phrase went, was going to get pushed off the steamship of modernity. That didn't last very long. Pushkin defeated Marx resoundingly, really, without much effort, and already by the late 1930s. And so few people realized, when they look about Soviet ideology, Marxism, Leninism, baloney. I went to school in the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s, never read Marx, never read Lenin, only in college, special classes. But in school, our school education was built entirely around the Russian literary pantheon, with Pushkin at the center, but then, of course, Tolstoy and the rest of them. And again, to add to it, this was the Russian part of the Soviet Union. The same orthodoxy prevailed everywhere. Everyone was expected to have a Pushkin. There was Shevchenko in Ukraine, and Rustaveli in Georgia, and so on. And in some cases, the way the Kalevala prevails in Finland, then, you know, the Manas epic is important for the Kyrgyz, and so on. But everybody was to have one, and if you didn't have one, you had to create one really fast, the way some of those were enthroned in the 19th century. But when it comes to today's, and one thing I would add, when it comes to the difficulty of somehow bringing members of the West together and then connecting them to other good guys, that is that the West consists of two completely different, even Europe, completely different cultures. In Western Europe, you have the story of repentance, pioneered and well represented by Germany in particular. But everywhere else, you know, there I was at Oxford teaching, and all the talk is about how do we get rid of this, that, or the other. And what do we do with the history of imperialism and any number of crimes? And of course, you can't say Sweden for the Swedes, meaning ethnic Swedes. That's the crime against humanity. In Eastern Europe, it's the exact opposite. Poland, Hungary, and especially the Baltic republics, Ukraine, are mono-ethnic, you know, very strong mono-ethnic rhetorically, not in terms of who lives there, regimes with intense cults of national poets, national pantheons, and tribal unity, coherence, and histories, and so on. So there's that. There is that interesting tension within Europe, within the West, as a whole.
But this has an interesting and not so difficult explanation, because for example, all the countries that started European Union have been former empires. All East European countries have been born out of the disintegration of empires. For most of the Western countries, 20th century was a place in which people have been moving, and their society has been becoming much more multicultural. In Eastern Europe, particularly after 1950s, the movement of people basically was leading to a very much ethnic homogeneity, because you have the wars, destructions, expulsion of people after the World War II. So from this point of view, yes, you have this tension. It is there, but in my view, there is something else. And there is a lecture which in 1995, Geertz delivered in our institute in IWM in Vienna, which I found one of the most interesting texts. It's called The World in Pieces, about the end of the Cold War. So he went, very famous American anthropologist, I mean, one of the canonical American anthropologists, and he said, listen, you're getting totally wrong the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War is not about convergence. The end of the Cold War is about re-emergence of certain type of differences and others that have been frozen by the Cold War. So we're going to see much more diversity and not much more convergence. And then he comes with two questions, which for me is the questions that I want to ask you before we go to the public. He said, the two questions that are going to shape the post-Cold War period are the question, what is a country if it is not a nation? And what is a culture if it is not a consensus? You can answer, Geertz.
Well, I think it's a rhetorical question, I think.
No,
because he knew when he was asking it that for some places that question was much more difficult to answer than for others. It's much more difficult to answer for the West, the United States, for Europe, for all of them together. I think it is an interesting challenge. Russia has its own, because Russia is not quite as self-confident, or definitely is not as self-confident as civilization as China, or indeed India, or Iran, or Islam. But the West, what is it again? What is a country if not a nation? And what is a culture if there's no consensus? Well, I don't see I mean, the only source of consensus, it's again, in addition to what I think is a very interesting tension between the self-deprecating West and the, if you will, narcissistic tribal East, and you're right in that there are reasons for it, but I think the fact is there to be observed. And it's the tension between the West presenting a virtuous face to the world, because it's always fighting against darkness, representing forces of light. And yet within, there is also, it's of course not new to the West, but I think now it's particularly striking when one looks at what, because people my generation, my colleagues, friends in the United States, went to school to learn how to be patriotic citizens, and among other things, why the United States was the greatest country in the world. My son, in his high school in Berkeley, was learning about slavery and the Holocaust, and then depended on the teacher, perhaps nothing else. And that is, and again, I'm not talking about the closing, perhaps it's the opening of American and everybody else's Western mind, because the interest is global, it's human rights, indeed replaced the free world as the ideology or self-description, self-representation. But I think it is an interesting contrast between this agonizing self-doubt within and this apparent self, because, you know, people ask, what is Russia up to? Isn't it just evil? It's either Putin who is evil or Russia as a whole that's evil. It's not clear why they are doing what they're doing. But it is what we do know is that where would the West be without it?
But here's an interesting question, because I don't know how many of you have been listening to Putin's speech of 2 days ago, and in a certain way, he adopted the language, the rhetoric, which is basically totally doubling what, for example, is the Ukrainian discourse on this. And this is one thing that talking about particularly the idea of the Russian civilization strikes me. So basically he said that Russia is the major kind of a victim of Western colonialism, so it positioned Russia as anti-colonial power, which is fighting anti-colonial war in Ukraine. That's probably this position is possible slightly exaggerated, let's put it like this. Second, no, listen. He talks about American empire, not about the Ukrainian empire. So, but from this point of view, and then the second story is about civilizational discourse. We're a different civilization. And then suddenly, in my view, to be a civilization, it means to have a language of your own, which is very different than the language of the others. And I agree with this. The Chinese, who believes that somebody, I do believe Aner said it, for them there is China and the rest. And they're going to talk about their civilization in their own language. In a certain way, what I found very striking, and this is not the first thing that I find striking, I was also found striking that in the Russian-Ukrainian war, basically both sides are dressed in the uniforms of the World War II. And the biggest problem is who are the Nazi. And I do believe that the Ukrainians has a better argument to make on this, but in a certain way, everything is told as if it is reenacting something that has happened before. And the last point is all this idea of civilization in history. My first kind of a fear that the war is coming was when I read the essay that President Putin wrote in July, because how often in modern world you're going to see a president who is going to write a text that can be offered to the students in university? It's not about the quality, the very fact that you have a head of state writing not a manifesto, not a memo, not a this, but writing an essay. And this is essay about what it means to be Russian, what it means, why it's not possible to be Ukrainian. So obviously something is going on. So you're right that something on this civilizational formation is in crisis, but to what extent the West is not simply what exists in the eyes of the others. So in a certain way, the West is consolidated by the way it is attacked or affirmed by outside.
I think it's consolidated for as long as Russia remains evil, because Ukrainian national ideology is in many ways the opposite of what we are taught in the United States and in Western Europe. I didn't hear Putin talk about Russia being a victim of colonialism. I think he, not for the first time, talked about Russia fighting on behalf of the non-Western world.
Okay. Yeah.
He talked about that earlier, and in his speech the other day, he mentioned the Soviet Union carrying that burden on behalf of the rest of the world, and now Russia is doing the same, and that has been the Russian official line for some time now, that they represent what they now call pretty consistently the non-West. And so the line is that we are being told that Russia is isolated, and it isn't. We are being told that the entire world is against us, but it isn't. Look at the vote by, the ones who count: China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and so on. So that indeed is a kind of civilizational, or if you will, the anti-Western civilization discourse. I think, and it was an interesting speech, I didn't think it was very successful in that most of it was, I think, aimed at the non-Russian, non-Western audience. Yet there he was speaking in the Kremlin. But insofar as it is then relayed to various points in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, perhaps it certainly makes political strategic sense. As for the war and the Nazi uniform, first of all, it was certainly for the longest time the only really moral absolute of the Western world, right? The Nazis and the Holocaust. And so I remember arriving in the United States, and every pledge drive on public television, you saw some Nazis there because those were the documentaries people wanted to see. And indeed, it's not only today in Ukraine, but in 2014, when the war began, I remember compulsively, obsessively watching videos, interviews with local field commanders on both sides and so on. And they were indeed talking about, they were fighting World War II all over again. And on the Ukrainian side, Ukrainian nationalist side, the story was pretty coherent, that sort of national story that made sense in so many different ways. And their wartime heroes were obvious enough. On the eastern side, there was no coherence of any kind except for that one. That our grandfathers fought against those guys' grandfathers, and we may disagree on everything else, but we are not accepting those people as our heroes. And that was, so many of them would say the same thing over and over again.
Agree, but here, because for me this is a very, very important conversation, because when I was listening to Putin in 22nd of February, this is just before the war, this was the strongest anti-Soviet speech which I have heard. So this ambiguity towards the Soviet Union is there. On one level, he speaks about Soviet Union being on the side of the anti-colonial revolutions, which is historically true in many cases, but at the same time in this speech, which I don't know how many of you remember, he made 3 points. He didn't speak like a red colonel. He spoke like a white guard general. It was, first, Russians are the biggest victims of the Soviet Union. Secondly, Ukraine was created by the Soviets. And thirdly, in a certain way, this war was very much the destruction of the Soviet identity. The most tragic figure of this war was this old Ukrainian lady with the Soviet flag, which went to basically meet the Russian armies, not understanding that these basically were not Soviet troops. In a certain way, in the Soviet identity, you can live somewhere in Ukraine without asking yourself, are you Ukrainian or are you Russians? The moment when the Russian army entered, you should make this choice. And by the way, the same was in Yugoslavia, in Sarajevo, where you can be Yugoslav without asking yourself, are you Serbian or Muslim? And this was the end. So in a certain way, he destroyed the Soviet identity. I mean, nobody can be Soviet, at least on the territory of Ukraine. So this is the thing that I found kind of very interesting, but also highly problematic. And where you're right is that on what happened on the Western and the Ukrainian side, also something changed dramatically compared with the Cold War. For example, the term Russism cannot exist during the Cold War. Because in the Cold War, the idea is you have an evil regime, but the Russian people are good. And this was a political decision. How good were now people are talking about public opinion polls. Listen, during the Soviet period, the public opinion polls were not very much that all Soviet people were against the Soviet Union. But then you're making a kind of ideological choice in which you're claiming Russian people are the biggest victim of the Soviet regime. And this is why we can talk to them, we can mobilize. This is why you cannot basically ethnicize the problem. What I see in the Ukrainian conflict is much more the language which we know from the anti-colonial and post-colonial situation, in which basically Ukraine is defining Russia in the way basically Algerians have been defining French, in the way basically, this is a typical post-colonial language in which you're trying to create this type of a language. It is there. So this is why, of course, also Putin's idea, when you go with something that in reality is a recolonization war, you go there, you're telling this and that, and at the same time speaking about anti-colonial, it's difficult. In the way it's difficult for the Ukrainians to explain why they're anti-colonial force when the former empires are on your side. So this kind of ambiguity is something that I found particularly important for the situation on the level of symbolic language. But let's go, because I slightly misused the time. Can I go back to all of you and ask your questions and you can respond to this? Eric and Kasia.
Original thesis, I was wondering whether there has not the cultural globalization, internet, social media, Netflix, Disney, everything we experience, English language as a new lingua franca, has not created a new Western canon, which is, of course, people are not reading all these books, but they didn't read, most young Americans did not read Plato and Homer when you were teaching, and those that did read it forgot it then by the next year probably, and it didn't really influence their lives. But all these the myths, the memes even, aren't they creating something which is also kind of dominating the thinking and of in today's world, going back to Odyssey with Ariel, Lord of the Rings. I mean, you can create kind of a big circle going from the ancient time into today's world, which is kind of unifying in what we call the West.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree, absolutely. But that the culture you have now described is global. It originates in the West, primarily in the United States. But it is not bound, because we were talking about civilizations that are bound by definition. And this, you go to Vietnam, and people who own TVs are watching Manchester United play Chelsea. And in Russia, people are watching those same shows, or at least did until it became difficult to do so. So I absolutely agree with you, but that is already, if there is such, certainly McNeil's definition wouldn't allow for such a thing as global civilization. But that would be, that is a culture that does not have a particular cultural referent, the way all of those others did, right? The Confucian canon or Firdausi Shahnameh. And I would, by the way, say just quickly that it's interesting that globalization culturally is what you just mentioned. It is not having American school children read, instead of Plato and Odysseus, read a little bit of the Analects and Shahnameh and a bit of the Quran. They're sort of confronting big civilizations. Nobody has the remotest interest in reading what they are about, or what they claim to be about. What you do is that you divide the West into the empty core and then the various minority tribal solidarities, which is a very interesting, I think, transformation, accompanied by the process that you have described so nicely.
Gotcha.
Started with poets, so my question we're gonna concern national poets. Well, I'm Polish, so my national poet is Adam Mickiewicz. Well, there was some competition, but he won. Yet Adam Mickiewicz was born in today Belarus. He studied in Vilnius. He spent most of his life traveling through Russia and Europe. He lived in Paris and died in Istanbul. And yet he's still considered the creator of Polish national identity. So my question is, so what constitutes this creator of national identity, national poet, if it's clearly not necessarily, a birthplace, residence, or even the language you speak on a daily basis?
Oh, it is the language. I think most of those poets are seen as the founders of the national standard, literary standard. Their canonization is part of a general canonization of the vernacular, of the spoken language, as opposed to Latin or whatever, or in case of the Orthodoxy, Church, Old Church, Slavonic, and so on. So it is about the cult of language. There are other national heroes, cultural heroes, Chopin in Poland, or the fine arts in Holland are more important in Vondel than their national poet, but still nobody studies music and the fine arts in school. People used to read books, and so in other words, it doesn't matter. Petofi, the national writer of Hungary, was Slavic by origin, and Vezdoslav in Slovakia was, I think, Hungarian. It doesn't matter. And Pushkin, of course, was, part African-American, and Lermontov was Scottish by origin, if you, pay attention to his last name, and so on. It doesn't matter. What matters is the language in which they write, and to some degree, although not necessarily, the images that they create, and that then the culture lives with, right? Especially those romantic ones, they create native landscapes, and all sorts of things that go with it, although it doesn't have to be the case when you canonize someone well after the fact. What happened to Shakespeare and Dante and Cervantes and Camões, for example.
Yeah, please.
I'm mostly interested in oppositions. If I understood you correctly, this course in Western civilization was conceptualized before the rise of the Cold War. But still, the opposite of Western civilization seems to be Russia, communism, Eastern Europe, not the Far East. So you can all, if I put it in more general terms, right now, what would be the opposite of Western civilization if you're talking about a term like Western civilization today?
I think you could say that, but not generally. The Western civilization was compared to other civilizations. I said the most popular book on the subject, The Rise of the West by William McNeill, did not oppose Western civilization to Russia. Russia was not quite civilization, was part of the Orthodox Christian civilization, which was nowhere near the compact civilization that Western Christianity was, because obviously it was fragmented into national languages, unlike the Latin one, which was Latin. And so it's a brilliant book, I think, still worth reading today. He spends quite a bit of time on China, on India, on Persia, on Islam, and so on. Some, a little bit, if I remember correctly, on the Mayas and the Incas and so on. It is the free world, as opposed to Western civilization, that was opposed to the slave world, at the center of which was, of course, the Soviet Union. The free world was defined negatively. It was everything except for the communists. Everything outside the communist world. And so you had this difficulty that I think is still there between the West as being universal, and so the West as an empire, political, military alliance represents itself as the international community, to the indignation of so many people around the world. And somehow having a particular story, and that story, at least in the textbooks that I used in my teaching, was essentially projecting American liberalism back as far as it went. So it was a story of, and that's how McNeill defined the nature of his book, the story of liberty. That's what the West was about, is how liberty was born, and then, of course, it would spread around the world. Just one quick thing is that towards something you said, is that not to let Putin off the hook, is that with all the confusions within the West, Russia is confused about itself because he's not entirely anti-Soviet. And it's not clear what Russia is doing because on the one hand, it is fighting for what they call the Russian world, which is to say, in the case of Ukraine, mostly saving Russian people and Russian speakers from oppression by others. And on the other hand, Russia is proud of being the only non-monoethnic state among all post-Soviet states. It's, if you don't like it, call it empire. If you like it, call it multinational federation. And so Putin says both things out of two sides of his mouth, and his audience is in flux, and you don't quite know what it is they're fighting, since, according to some, the greatest fighters are, the Buryat and the Chechens. And yet they're fighting for the Russian world to save Russian speakers from, Ukrainian oppression or Western onslaught. So, in other words, there's mess everywhere.
No, but this is something, please, your question, because it's the last question.
I would like to draw the attention to one point that is the female point. I'm sitting here, I hear from heroes, male politicians, male writers, male anywhere, and as to my impression, these confrontations of the culture is just a confrontation between more or less patriarchy, but there is actually no alternative thinking of including everything and not just male players.
Well, I am not proposing anything, really. I'm just describing things the way I see them, and history the way I understand it. And so it's not, I am not saying that Pushkin should be the national poet of Russia. I'm stating the fact that he is. But on that particular topic, it's very, of course, unusual, for reasons I think most of us understand. But still, in the national poet of Galicia, on the Iberian Peninsula, is a woman, Rosalía de Castro. In Estonia, Lydia Koidula is a very serious contender for that role. And of course, in Japan, The Tale of Genji, the absolute classic text of Japanese culture, was written by a woman. So it's not an entirely male story, but because history is something we can't remake completely, it's dominated by men.
So, on this, is there one more question if we can get? Yeah, please.
I mean,
Thank
if
you.
it's not a problem. So I hope this is not too fundamental question, especially that we don't have that much time. But since you also in the title of the talk talked about decline, which is very sort of normative term, I would just want to hear a bit what is the actual sort of value of civilizational thinking. Is there a reason that the West should actually think of itself as a civilization with shared canons or shared tradition? And relatedly, I think that the self-understanding of the West, at least in the mainstream political circles, is a civilization with many cultures and many traditions, but with shared values. So, for example, when you mentioned the Declaration of the Human Rights, it's not a traditional, it's not a canonical text because it's more a declaration of certain values, and it's not a text in the same sense as Shakespeare is. Because, I mean, you can understand the ideas in the Declaration without reading it, but you have to read Shakespeare to understand Shakespeare. So, I don't know, could you say something about this sort of civilization understanding itself as constituted by values and a civilization understanding itself as constituted by canons?
Thank you very much. By the way, this is a great question because you talk about the decline of the Western civilization. Should we be sorry about this? To what extent the legal texts are not changing the literary text? So this is the best last question that we could have invented. Please.
Well, maybe we should just then leave it at that. It's really a wonderful way to end the discussion, because this is a question for all of us, right? It clearly is a civilization. I mean, by McNeil's definition, whatever it is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights brings together is not a civilization, it's the world. And it is a world defined in Western terms, a world that consists of individuals. Most Chinese would not recognize such a world. But let's say, so in other words, one is civilization, according to that definition, is the civilization, and the other one is the world. And now whether we should bemoan the fact that we are moving, or some people are trying to move from one to the other, I think it's up to all of us to decide and to celebrate or lament, as the case may be. So thank you all very much for coming. And thank you very much, Ivan.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Yuri.